Hi there, and welcome to the Rethinking the Human Factor Cybersecurity mini-series. Now, this is episode 4 out of a grand total of 6 episodes in this, our first cybersecurity mini-series. Now, for those of you who are new to the show and the Rethinking the Human Factor, what is it all about? Well, quite simply put, it's all about helping our listeners better understand what it means to be human so that they can more effectively raise awareness, influence behavior, and foster an organizational culture where security is truly valued. So what's the sort of format to the Rethinking the Human Factor? Well, the challenges of awareness, behavior, and culture and changing them are not actually unique cybersecurity. So what we do is we go out of our way to find people who sometimes are practitioners and sometimes they're academics, sometimes they even span both sides of the fence, who specialize in a wide variety of aspects of human awareness, behavior, and culture. And we get them to come on the show and they share some amazing insights. And you can take those insights away and use those to sort of rethink how you are addressing the challenge of employee awareness, behavior, and culture within your organization. But hold on, we're not quite finished there. We also really love to get people who are thought leaders, in our opinion, in the area of education awareness and behavior and culture within organizations from within the cybersecurity industry. Sometimes those people are CISOs, education awareness managers, and information security professionals who have the responsibility for delivering a human focus within their organization. And on other occasions, for example, with our mini cybersecurity series, we team up with organizations from within the cybersecurity industry who put the human at the heart of everything they do in terms of design processes, which bring around changes in products and services, and who make the human core part of their vision for addressing cybersecurity now and in the future. And today, one of those vendors is sponsoring our mini-series, and that vendor goes by the name of Proofpoint, who I'm sure don't need any introduction to you. So what kind of show do we have for you today? Well, today we're going to be sort of like tuning in to the challenges around learning and development and the use of technology of that, how things have changed with COVID-19 and how changing working practices are having an impact upon the challenge of how you actually develop competency within not just an organization, but more broadly across society when it comes to cybersecurity. Our guest has a huge track record in this particular field. This is somebody that has contributed to government policy in the area of learning and development and under the Obama administration. And this is somebody who's actually had some exposure to working and somebody that's had exposure to cybersecurity and the implications of that, both in terms of the risk to national infrastructure and organizations, but also the challenge about how do you actually develop competency in that area. And for somebody who just published their own book around the challenges of developing competency across the whole of society, starting with youngsters, to be able to be good digital citizens in the future. So without any further ado, let's get on with the interview. Hi there, welcome to the Rethinking the Human Factor with me, your host, Bruce Hallis. Now, it's great to have you here with us on the show again today. So, great, Richard, fantastic to have you here on the show.
That was quite an intro, Bruce. I am honored to be here. It's great to join the conversation.
Do you know what? One of the best tests when it comes to awareness of anything is, can you actually remember anything? And I'm just like, wow, I'm surprised I remembered all of that. That's really good work.
I can't even remember most of that, so that was impressive.
Okay, well, next time you need a nudge, come and give me a shout. I'll try and remind you of all the great stuff that you've been up to. Okay. So, Richard, look, if I haven't taken the wind completely out of your sail with that introduction, do you want to just let us know what is the journey that you've been on to the point where you are today?
Yeah, I mean, I think you captured really well this space that I've tried to play, which is that I am, I'm an educator by training, right? I am a teacher, but through a number of interesting career opportunities, I ended up spending some roles in both the tech industry and also in the intelligence world. And because of that, I have these sort of two, kind of different lenses that I see the world through, right? Through both, and through the view of somebody who knows learning and how, human cognition works and how people learn and understand, and through the lens of technology, and particularly technology related to security issues. And it turns out there aren't many people that wear those two lenses, right? There are lots of people that wear the lens of learning and learning science. There's lots of people that wear the infosec and sort of technology lens, and few that kind of put both of those on. And it means that I see some things in some interesting ways, right? I see the way that we go about preparing people to thrive in a virtual world is not always the most effective from a learning standpoint. And vice versa, when we think about how we do learning, we often leave out some really critical elements of how we can be effective, safe, thriving people in virtual spaces. So my whole goal is to help call attention to both sides of those conversations, to blur the conversation, which is frankly why I gave that talk that you mentioned about why we need more humanities majors work in tech. And the other side of that is when I talk to humanities majors, I say they all need to go take some computer science courses, right? Because we need to blur the two sides of the conversation if we're going to have a shot at being an effective digital society.
As you're saying that, and you're talking about the lenses. Now, I often talk about culture in the context of lenses and biases, and we all have these different lenses. But I wear glasses, and as you're talking about, I just had a flashback. Okay, I'm sat down in the opticians. I'm having an eye test, and they put on. You don't wear glasses, do you? No. Have you ever had the eye test where they put the big eye things on there, and then the optician opens up this box? It's just got loads of different filters in it, hasn't it? Lenses. And they're slowly putting one in at a time and asking you to read ahead. And it's like you can have two lenses put in, take one out, and you see things completely differently than that. And it's almost like, for you, the two lenses are the role of cognition, okay? That whole, what is the world of education and learning development, how it's being influenced by our increase, how much more we know now about how people think and process information and act upon that. So there's that bit going on. And then there's, there was a technology piece as well that's going on as well. These are two separate filters, two separate lenses. Okay, great.
And, and just one more point on that is we used to have the luxury of being able to keep those as two separate filters, right?
Yeah.
But as our relationship with technology has fundamentally changed, and that's been accelerated by COVID, but it was on a path to change anyway. And now we don't have that luxury to be able to look at one separate from the other. We have to look at how we are, preparing ourselves to be effective in virtual spaces through the lens of what we know about how people learn, and vice versa, if we're going to have a shot at, creating a healthy digital work and life environment.
Okay, so let's start off with, for me, the thing I'm really, really passionate about is what advances in our understanding of cognition and the whole, behavioral sciences piece. What key advances do you think have come about which are now really having an impact upon how people develop like learning strategies, whether that be a learning strategy for a whole nation? I know you've been involved in that sort of scale of work, which is massive, okay? Or it could be learning strategy in the context of a school, or probably for most of our listeners, it would be learning strategies for helping develop competency within a workplace around anything, for example, information security.
Yeah, so let me share, there's many, many parts of how we learn that we could talk about that are important to be aware of. But let me just pick two that I think are particularly important. The first is we are understanding more and more now the importance of learning in context, right? So when you learn a skill, concept, the more closely the environment where you learn that skill or context can be to the environment where you will need to use that skill or context, it is much more likely that you will be able to make the right choices and do the right things in that moment, right? Draw on that information. Unfortunately, we have a history in traditional education, in workplace learning, in pretty much anywhere we do learning. We have a tradition of teaching and assessing learning in a context that's very different from where it's going to be used. Right? In school, you took a test, a multiple choice test to check on your understanding of knowledge. But rarely in your life does somebody come up to you in a street and say, hey, I have a question for you. Is it A, blah, 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 B, blah, 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 C, blah, 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 and you pick which one? No, nobody, we don't talk like that. We never use information in a multiple choice format. We continue to do that as a way of testing knowledge. And so And you can see some of the changes that have started to happen in schools. There's a big movement called project-based learning, right?
Okay.
Which is this idea of, instead of teaching by doing something completely out of context, let's do a project. Let's do something that would be similar to where you would interact with those ideas and those new skills in the real world. And by doing so, it means that when you encounter them in the real world, you're much more likely to remember the things that you have learned. Right.
Yeah.
In the workplace, it's the same thing. So when it comes to, there's all kinds of workplace training where we sit in front of a computer and we click next on a bunch of slides that go by. I call them nexters, right? We click next, next, and we read what's on the screen, and then we answer a little question and we get a certificate, right? But again, rarely is that the environment, the context where those ideas come up, where those skills of how to, deliver a product or product manage or make choices about how to not compromise your company by opening, attachments from somebody that you don't know, right? When we learn about those out of context, they're very hard to remember. And so we need to make sure we are training in as close to the environment as possible as you can. So I'm a pilot. I fly small planes, and it's why pilots use flight simulators. Because yes, you're not going to crash a real plane to learn how to, keep from having an emergency.
Yep.
But on the other side, taking a multiple choice test isn't going to be very helpful either. And so we create flight simulators so that you can be as close as you can to that moment of needing to make adjustments and changes to the plane, that when you're in a real emergency, you remember.
Yeah.
And that's this first strategy about learning, is we need to make learning as close as possible to the real environment.
Okay. Yeah.
So that's thing one. The second one, and this one is also very important, and that is the idea that we over-focus on providing information to learners, input. We give them lots of information.
Yeah.
But it turns out what's more important is not what we put in their brains, right? It's their ability to recall what they have learned.
Yep.
So it's that recall that matters. And yet we focus almost all on input and not enough on giving them opportunities to practice recall. Yep. And I'll give you the one example where this is super obvious. And this is that in order to really have effective recall, it's helpful. You have to space the recall opportunities over lots of time. It's called spaced repetition, right?
Okay.
And so if you take a class, a training, and you pack it into 1 8-hour day, the chances of being able to recall that information when it's needed is much less than if you split it up into 16 half-hour moments throughout a month or so. And in fact, you might even find that you could do 8 half-hour touch points along the way, spaced over time, and you would actually learn much more than 8 full hours sitting in a classroom. So in half the time, you actually could have much better recall if it's spaced out over a series of, days.
Right. Okay. Really, really important, and totally, completely back you up on that. I'm not sure I could say it quite as excited as you, though. But yeah, the two things there, really, the environment. I'm a huge, huge believer in this, is that if you're taught within a particular environment, like a specific learning environment, it's not a real reflection of the environment that you're going to be making those. You're going to be A, trying to recall it, and B, actually then doing something with that. So you might know, for example, you should do this, but in reality, when you should do it, are you going to do it? It's like the environment isn't the right environment to increase the odds in your favor that you're going to, 1, recall, 2, do something about it. So I think that's really important for the listeners to understand that. The environment is absolutely vital. And your point is that if the way to try and address that is to shift as best you can the environment towards what it's, you talked there about the flight simulator. So shift it from being like, it's a desktop exercise with tick boxes to it's a real exercise within a controlled environment. And that's and then you can go any further than that. Absolutely fantastic. Okay. The second one was to focus on our reliance. The assumption that we make is that we give people information. And I think, in an information-rich society, for quite some time, the whole, not just around education, but, about pretty much any national policy area, the philosophy was give people the information, they will make the choices. And the argument is the more information you have, more of information, there is more power associated. So you're enabling people by giving them information. But it hit a point for most people where they get information overload, and that can vary for different people. And they sit back and go, do you know what? I'm not going to do with anything with this because it's just way too much. And so there is that problem of, first thing I think is information overload is just people don't engage with it, to start with. And the second point is when they have engaged with it, doesn't really add any value unless they can remember it at the right time. This is sort of like, I have this design philosophy, which is less is more. And what you're saying there is instead of doing it in one big block, split it down into smaller blocks. I think what's really interesting, I wasn't aware of this, but what you're saying is that actually if you add up the sum of those parts, those small parts, then the value of that can often be much, much better, much, much greater. Yeah,
that's right. Absolutely. And so it's actually a more efficient use of time.
Yeah.
It just requires a different way of thinking about it than we normally have. Again, when we think about learning either in schools or in the workplace, we think about like scheduling by days, block of days or half block of days. And that's just not a very useful way for most things, right? Sometimes you need a little deep dive, or if you're going to do a simulation, you might need a chunk of time. But the idea is that it's much better to think about learning in terms of this sort of smaller chunk repeated over multiple days or multiple weeks or whatever. And if you do that, you'll find that you actually will use less overall time and end up with a much more effective, learning experience just by thinking just by understanding how the brain works, right?
Yeah. Okay. Got a question for you. What's your view on trying to increase memory by actually taking the people that are being trained and actually just by asking them or just telling them that at the end of this training, you will be asked to train other people? So I've heard that it has a real impact in terms of getting people's attention. So there's one thing, we tend to respond to, I'm being taught, okay? And then there's, I'm being taught because I'm going to be asked to teach other people. And suddenly that small shift in focus just makes us somehow, I don't know if it's a sense of responsibility or something. I don't know, because I haven't, other than reading research about this, I haven't actually performed in research myself. Does that really make a difference?
So what you're getting at is a term that in the learning space, we talk about motivation, right? And motivation is critical to having effective learning, right?
Right.
And there's a number of ways that you can motivate people. One way that you can motivate them, as you mentioned, is to say, you're going to need to actually teach this to other people. So that's a motivating factor. You don't want to let your coworkers down or whatever it is, right? That's one side. Another way to motivate people is to make a very clear alignment back to their ability to do their job better or do the work that they care about better, right? And that's, again, another problem with a lot of learning opportunities is there's not a clear alignment to something that the learner cares about or sees value in.
Yeah.
And so that's a very simple one. Be more overt about why learning this will help with something that you care about. Now, it's a little tricky because the things that everybody cares about are different. There's not a blanket statement. You actually have to know a little bit about the learner in order to be able to help see how this relates to them, right? But whatever way we go about it, being clear that we are recognizing that there has to be motivation on behalf of the learner and helping tee that up, right? It's another just huge factor in whether or not the learning is going to be effective.
I mean, and I think just from having this, brief chat with you, I mean, the clear thing there is when you think about education, often education gets seen as, rightly or wrongly so, okay, we're going to get people to pass, this is the test they've got to pass, and this is their this is knowledge we transfer. This is the competencies test. They are competent to do their duties, their roles and responsibilities. But the point you're coming back to here, and it relates to the cognition pieces, that ain't enough. Okay, if you want to turn that into real benefit to the individual, the organization, the national economy, for example, okay, it's all about influencing behavior. It's equipping people to have the skills so they can take a particular course of action. And that's integrating all this sort of behavioral science piece, which you've gone through 3 core parts of cognition that I'm aware of, and just finished off with motivation there, which is something. So you have to incorporate that as defining the objective and then how I'm going to achieve it, because it could be we just teach them, and then the other one is we teach them, but we want to change their behavior.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think an important point to note here, and you alluded to this a minute ago, is, these are things we always should have done, right? Sure.
Yeah.
But in a less complicated world, in a less information overload world, we could get away with learning experiences that were less efficient and less effective.
Yeah.
But in a world where there's so much more information, there's so many more important skills that are required to thrive in a globally connected world, we don't have the luxury of being inefficient and ineffective with how we learn anymore.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so critical that now, again, these principles aren't new, but now they're more important than ever because we are competing with so much additional information and stuff that people have to learn that we can't afford to be ineffective in our learning at this point.
So that brings us on really nicely to another area, which is a bit of a hot topic for me. I mean, as we come through the COVID-19 pandemic, there is a lot of speculation in the media and even probably across, networks and amongst friends and work colleagues about what the future workplace looks like. And I know this is something that you're quite interested in. And so, just as an observation, two small observations, really, I've seen organizations that have increasingly said, look, we're going to move to a 4-day week. Okay. So they're still expecting to produce the same results or better in less time. Okay. But still, arguably, everybody's still got to get all the stuff done. And that includes their personal development, making sure they're competent to be able to fulfill their jobs. Those jobs are always going to involve a lesser or greater degree information security and privacy. So there's that first one is the shortening of the number of hours in the week. And the second one is flexi time. Now, flexi time has been around, increasingly for a while, I reckon now. So the whole idea was that traditionally you work 9 till 5, or if you're over in the US, 6 till 7 in the morning. But that was the specific, you had contracted hours. And then suddenly, what we're talking about is allowing you to, whenever you want during the day, in effect, as long as you use the results. Okay. So suddenly you go from, if you're somebody responsible for developing the competency of your staff around information security or any other subject matter, for example, you're like, oh, it's not 9 to 5 any longer. They might be off between 2 and 4. So how do those changes affect how we go around learning and development within the organization? Because surely they must have an impact. And it does come back to that effectiveness and productivity, I think, which is the point you were just making.
Yeah, so a couple principles there that are important to know. And by the way, I do think it's important to have flexibility wherever and however we can. I think one thing that COVID has taught us is that we actually need flexibility to adapt to life, issues, challenges, balance, right? So that's very important. And also, there is value in physically working together, right? Or virtually working together. There's value in working together in collaboration. I think we've seen from COVID that, at least I have, that I've missed some of the opportunities for collaboration that have been a little harder to do during this time. Mm-hmm. And so what I think is important is that there is the balance, right? There is what works for, how can we be flexible, and how can we also ensure that there is time that we are all, together, or at least groups that are working together so that they're sharing and providing their information. I think the underlying principle, which is actually a learning principle here, is that those decisions can't be made as a blanket and applied to everybody, right? There are different needs from a learning standpoint, from a mission standpoint, whatever the competencies of your team or you individually are going to determine a variety of different work environments, schedules, et cetera. And so I think that's the takeaway here, is that whether it's, as we think about the future of work, I hope that we do a much better job of personalizing the experience to the needs of the individuals and the teams. And that's where we didn't do a very good job of that pre-COVID. Some places may have, but not as much. And it's the same when you think about learning. It's the same way, right? When you go into a learning experience and there has been no attempt at the beginning to see what you already know, right? What your learning needs are.
Yeah.
Your buy-in to participate in that learning experience goes way down because you don't even check. You made the attempt to see what I already know. So why am I going to think that this stuff that you're teaching me matters, right? Yeah. So that's a really important principle, is if we can line up to what our, employees or our students, depending on what age, already know, then the learning experience can be much more tailored. And I think that concept also can apply to general work environments as well.
I think it's really interesting because when I've looked at the learning industry and the development industry, and a lot of the things that I was probably more exposed to when I was slightly younger, it was based upon a lot of assumptions. as is a lot of life. A lot of people make assumptions, and when you actually challenge them, so you said this, on what grounds can you say that? And a lot of it has been, things that people have learned from other people without challenging them. And there's just these assumptions that sort of grow. And the learning industry is full of, for example, like, rote learning, for example, and, the different types of, I'm an audio person, I'm a visual person, all that, which is rampant in this industry, in the security industry. Are you a listener?
By the way, Bruce, we have a name for this. I don't know if you know this. We actually have a name for this in the learning space. We call them zombie learning theories.
Oh, right.
We call them zombie learning theories because they're learning theories that have been thoroughly debunked. They've been dead for years.
Yeah.
They still kind of hang around and walk around and linger, even though they don't exist. So that one that you brought up just now, this idea of learning styles, I hear that all the time. There's no evidence. It has been so thoroughly debunked. Learning styles do not exist. Yeah. Right? People may have preferences for how they like to learn, but there's very little correlation between what they say they like to learn and actually their ability to learn and recall things, right? And yet, like a zombie, that learning theory just keep persisting around our organizations. And there are others. There are others that we can talk about too. Left brain, right brain is another one. Does not exist. It is a zombie learning theory. It needs to die, but it still sort of wanders around, right? So those are the sorts of things that we do have to watch out for because they're handed down and we assume that there's value in them without actually checking to know that they've been, dead for 30 years.
Yeah, you see, I have this thing that I'm just about to kick off called Mythbusters, which has a strong relationship, I suspect, to the Ghostbusters, but legally completely different type of things at all. But yeah, a lot of what gets done is based upon myths and legends and not upon science. And I think that's the point in many ways we're trying to do in this podcast is say that, hey, there's a lot of science that's gathering around this nowadays. It helps you to cut through all the clutter and to really focus on things. So, going back to that flexi time, the hours thing, the thing that sprung straight to my mind as we were talking about that was the opportunity for like running projects. So, that point you were saying is that, yes, we all have to be sort of individually, we're all working remotely in different spaces, but then we come together for certain things. And one of those opportunities for coming together could be around a project-based learning approach to information security. So bringing different people from different parts of the organization together for a specific project around information security and making that the learning experience and scheduling that into the diary so everybody comes together for that. That's, as you were talking, I was like, that would be an idea actually. Yeah, okay, brilliant. So tick that one off. Okay, right. Engagement, and I don't mean getting engaged to the love of your life, okay, right? But as people are overloaded with information, trying to get their attention becomes a core focus. And then once you've got their attention, then it's like, how do you maintain that? How do you maintain that level of engagement? What challenges do you see within the learning environment around that whole, I need to get their attention in the first place. And then, once I've got it, how do I keep them engaged over a period of time? You've already mentioned there about the idea of shorter periods of time. But is there anything else around that, getting that attention in the first place and then maintaining that engagement going forward?
I think the key, there are two things that I like to think of with engagement. So, and we've talked a little bit about both of them, right? One of them is just being really clear why this matters to the person who is learning, not the person who's sharing the information, right?
Yeah.
If you're a CISO, you're the head of security somewhere, and you're like, you got to know not to open emails that have weird attachments from your, uncle who's the king of, some country in Africa, right? That's important. But that doesn't matter to the person who's learning unless they know that it's important to them. Mm-hmm. And so your first step is, why does this matter to the learner? And giving some real tangible examples about why it should and does matter to them really helps. So spend a bit more time on explaining why the thing that you're about to teach matters. That's thing one, right? Mm-hmm. Then the second thing is this idea of, as we've talked about, aligning it to what works for learning in the most effective way. And so saying, this is why it matters. And we're now going to help you learn about it in a way that is most effective for you. Those two things, right? Aligning to why it matters and aligning to a way that is more effective for learning can be really powerful for increasing motivation. And also, and this is another point that I really should make, is that means showing the learner how they are progressing.
Yeah.
Right. And so if you are having learning experiences, it's really important to show back to the learner here. When we ask these questions at the beginning, when we gave you this simulation or asked you these things, here were all the errors that you created. Right.
Yeah.
You made mistakes. You didn't know what you're doing. Now we've been doing this through the spaced repetition. We've been training on these ideas for a while. And let me show you, you actually are doing really well. Your ability to recognize how to use the information that we're teaching in these moments has increased. That's motivating for the learner because they're seeing progress. Anything that feels like check the box for learners, and so much InfoSec training feels completely check the box, which it should not. There is no excuse for InfoSec training to feel like it is check the box. It is one of the most important things that any employee anywhere is going to learn. Any kid in school, any student in college is going to learn. And so if it feels like it's a check the box exercise, then shame on whoever's created that training. There is absolutely no excuse for that.
Okay, so that's going to bring us on to this next, I guess, general topic area for me, content. Okay, because you can have somebody produce great content, okay, but it's not necessarily about the content, it's also about the delivery of it.
Sure.
Okay, and we actually had one of the US presidents, ex-speechwriters on the show. Okay, and I mean, I've read their material and it's absolutely fantastic. And you can see why, if you went to the US president, I'm sure that they could probably, really pen something really well, but they don't have, even though they are, they are who they are, they've got to where they are because of, their general intelligence. Okay. And you're sort of like, okay, so why would he have a speechwriter? Well, one, they don't necessarily have the time to be writing speeches. And two, well, actually, part of what makes a US president is their ability to tell the story. Okay, it's like the charisma that comes from the individual when they walk up onto the stage. It's their ability to recite things, to tell a story, to engage with the audience. The content is written by somebody else. How important when it comes to education, okay, is having really hot content, okay, and how quickly can the really hot content go really cold, okay, if the means of distributing that content is just not as equally as hot, I guess.
Well, I think it depends on what you mean by hot content, right? So, I mean, give me a sense. What do you?
So one is accuracy. Okay, but there's nothing worse than being educated on something and it's not necessarily 100% accurate. You go out there and the feedback is, you're wrong. Okay, all right. The second one is like accuracy. The third one is the ability, how easily it can be consumed. So, I know in my early career, I think it was because of my legal training, I would write, honestly, you didn't want to read anything that I wrote, because it was written by a lawyer. So I covered every single thing. And actually, the marketeer, I did marketing training, the marketeer wanting to say, minimize it. And the lawyer was going to put as much in as possible to cover yourself as much as possible. So there's there's accuracy of content. And then there's a way that you actually deliver that content in terms of the writing style. I mean, we have copywriters. We pay people to write really good copy.
Yeah. So I don't want to minimize good delivery, but it turns out that the ability to do some of these other things that we're talking about, right? Align to learner needs, create a clear sense of motivation, do this idea of like spaced repetition, the focus on recall, that stuff is all way more important than the quality of the delivery of the content.
Okay.
And it's a bit of a confusion. So there are places, and I see this more in the workplace than in schools, but in workplace where there's like, we're going to get it really slick and we're going to hire some actors to come in and like act out this scenario. And we're going to make sure it's highly produced. And we have this video that we've created and we've maybe spent a lot of money for it. And that's fine. But you could do the exact same thing with just a couple coworkers that you pull together with sort of low budget video and get it out. If it is aligned to those principles of learning that we talked about, it'll actually be much more effective than the highly produced version. And so don't conflate the quality of the delivery. Now, yes, if you have somebody who can deliver it a little bit better and there's a nicer story, like let's do that. I'm not saying put, junk in front of our learners.
Yeah.
But we often conflate the quality of the materials and the content as it's produced for some actually more effective learning strategies that we could use that we've been talking about so far.
So I think it's really important because this is what the show is all about. It's about saying, well, what are the marginal gains around the existing ways that we are doing things? And it is about applying those learning principles, design principles. And I am very focused on design with the human in mind. So you apply that to where you are at the moment, and that provides you with an uplift. Okay. And then it's like, if you want to go any further, if there is a case for going any further, then start to look at polishing things up a little bit more. I mean, one thing that came through my own, research was how the difference between something which is done authentically, by having employees, for example, who authentically wanted to take part, who knew the environment, who knew some of the challenges, etc., who were the actors. And then you had actors who you had to pay, okay, to pretend to be authentic. Yeah. And it's funny enough, when you look at the two of them on the screen, you're like, okay, people can tell the difference. And sometimes people go, oh, that's Samantha. She's from, operations. I know her. Yeah.
I literally had this argument. I worked in the federal government. We were making some training and it was about, effective technology use. It happened to be. And I said, here are the stories that we want to capture. And our, this team that was helping me produce this said, great, write it up in a script. We'll go get an actor and come in and do it. And I said, no, I want these people that we actually experienced this moment and made the choice that, changed how they were thinking. I want them to tell their story. And they don't have a voice that carries well on screen. And they don't have they don't sit and do this facial expressions that you would want a professional actor to do. And my point back was, that is not what I'm looking for. I want that quirky human person, right? That feels like me. Yeah, because I'm quirky and weird, and I know I'm not. I don't want it polished. I want it to feel like the actual, authentic human that experienced that thing that is sharing it with me. It ended up being a much, much more powerful learning experience, right? Yeah. Than the stuff that was overly polished.
Yeah. Authenticity all the time, if you could do that. And it generally keeps the costs down as well. Yeah.
Right. It also does. And it highlights people who you want to highlight. And there's all kinds of benefits for it. So keeping authenticity, humanity in all of the training and the learning that we do is really powerful.
Yeah. Okay. So I just want to go back on the content. So the point you were sort of making, it wasn't in the delivery, but the content is important, obviously, because it's got to be accurate, hasn't it? And it's got to be something that can be consumed by people. People are going to want to engage with it, and they've got to be able to, I guess, remember that. And also the content then is also about shaping the content. There's a phrase that I remember called chunking, which is about breaking it down into smaller pieces to make it more easily remembered. And we use that around things like, postcodes. So you're addressing your postcodes. That's got chunking in mind, isn't it?
Yeah. And to be clear, what I'm not saying is that we should not be thoughtful about the learning content that we put in front of our learners. We absolutely should. I like to think of it in terms of curation. I know that's a term that we normally use when we think of museums, but when we think about the role of a learning leader, of your curriculum learning experience, I like to think that the role is to be a curator, decide what information needs to be pulled in, what information would be distracting and not valuable and should be left out, what information might need to be created because it doesn't exist, and be smart to not create information that already exists in good spaces elsewhere, right? Yeah. Those are the roles of a good content curator. And that's what we really need to think of when we go into learning design mode. We need to think about being almost like a museum, right? We need to be a curator of the learning materials.
That's really interesting. It touches on something that I'm going to be raising in another episode. And something, I'm a huge believer, I guess in the corporate world, we'd call it data strategy. I would be like, what's your story? That's my thing for me is, okay, so where do you want to be? And what's your story for getting there? And what is the data that you're going to need to enable that journey to happen? And then designing a data strategy with that in mind. And the whole learning experience is, if the objective is to bring around changes in behavior, does your data strategy only get you to the point where you record that somebody's done the training and passed it, they've got the competency level, but does it tie in with what is the impact in the world in terms of bringing around changes in behavior and driving prosperity and all those type of things as well? It's like you have to have that sort of breadth of vision, don't you, as a learning professional? If the thing you're measured against is make sure that 100% of our workforce have passed this particular test and that the pass grade for that is this, okay, then you just gather data on that. If it is, we want our employees to behave in line with our security policy, okay, to reduce the number of negative security behaviors, which then reduces the risk to the organization, then you measure learning and development not on competency and test results, but upon the behavioral outcomes.
Well, I would say that those should be your test results, right? So you want to measure based on competency and test results. The question is, what is the test? And if the test is a multiple choice paper test, that doesn't seem very aligned to, that does not seem like a very effective way to demonstrate the new competencies.
Yeah.
Right. A much more effective way would be something like, and this is a trend that we're seeing more of, is the idea where sample emails are sent out with attachments, right? But they're not really, they're actually generated emails, and we see how many people open them. And then you can send a note that says, hey, we sent you 3 emails in the last week, and you open the attachment from all of them, even though the address made no sense and was from nobody that you knew, and the attachment was not anything you were expecting, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is a much more powerful test of the competency, assessment of the competency, than asking on a multiple choice quiz.
Yeah.
And so those are the sorts of things we need to be looking for. Is absolutely we should assess against the competencies, but that assessment had better be authentic.
Yeah.
And it had better feel like it is, relevant and aligned to the goals that you have for the training in the first place.
Yeah. So you're bringing out a new book, okay? And I know when we spoke about the new book, and we know one of the things that you were talking about there is, I know it's just generally something that you're passionate about, is that whole, developing a society, people who've got the right digital skills in place to be able to prosper within our digital economy and digital society. Most of the cultural values we we take into employment have been formed as children, really, and as, teenagers, young adult. What role do you think culture plays in attitudes towards technology? And I guess also vice versa, what role do you think technology plays in terms of influencing our culture?
Well, it's a great question. Our relationship with technology has fundamentally changed. And I think, again, accelerated by COVID, but it was already happening anyway. And that is that we are, in the book that you mentioned, I wrote a book called Digital for Good. And it's about how we are preparing young people to thrive in a digital world. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I start with is I just say, I think about, we sort of have this dual citizenship between the physical world and the virtual world. Mm-hmm. And we move back and forth between these worlds all the time. But for a long time, particularly pre-COVID, the virtual world was sort of an ancillary world, right? It was kind of our vacation home where we go for some entertainment, where we would, do some things because they were convenient, right? But that has shifted, become the primary host site for many of our life's most important activities, right? Yeah. Weddings are happening fully virtually, right? Certainly entertainment, but all finance, learning, so much learning is now happening entirely in virtual spaces. Family gatherings and family interactions, right? Healthcare, right? Our whole healthcare, getting information, having an appointment to be treated in a virtual space, right? Those are all things that are happening in virtual spaces. So as this shift has happened, the virtual space is no longer this ancillary thing. It really is the core home for many of the most important life activities that we experience.
Yeah.
And again, this is really the point of the book. You have not kept our training, our preparing of young people up to the task of preparing them to be in this world that is not an ancillary world, but one where is really critical for their future success in life and in work. Mm-hmm. And so that's a shift that we have to make. So our relationship with technology has shifted, and we have to now shift our thinking and our approach for preparing young people to be successful in this new world that we're in.
Yeah. Why do you think that lag happens? I mean, it's almost like those people that at a policy level thinking about, the future generation, the future workforce to some degree, prior to being a part of the workforce, they are obviously a really, the fundamental part of society. And it's almost like there's a lag happening. At some point, somebody should have, these changes are happening. So why aren't we thinking, what does this mean? And how do I need to start feeding that back into how we, as a society, how we prepare people? Because it's almost like by the time the problem's identified, the thinking's been done, the solution's been implemented, okay, we've already got through to another, with Moore's law, we've already moved on.
So it's really interesting. And I spent some time, as I was doing the research for the book, I spent some time looking at how did we get here, right? What is it that got to this place? And there's a number of things, I can share some of them, but one of the things I discovered is, we are the first generation. We really are as parents, right? We're the first generation that has really had to prepare the sort of next generation for this virtual world that they're in, right? Mm-hmm. We kind of just stumbled into it as it was evolving around us.
Yeah.
And so this is new to us. It's a new skill. It's not a conversation that we had to have before. And because of that, we have been very haphazard about how we're having the conversation. And actually, let me give you two examples that I saw as interviewing parents and working with schools around the world about this. There are two fundamental flaws in how we are preparing the next generation to thrive in a virtual world. And so the first is our conversations are entirely negative, far too negative. And so they tend to sound like, don't share information you shouldn't online. Don't post something that you don't want to be there for a while. Don't be a jerk. Don't share your password. Don't. It is a list of don'ts.
Yeah.
And the challenge is these are tough skills that we need to learn how to do. And they are complex skills to be, effective members of a virtual world. And they require practice. And it turns out you can't practice not doing something, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I joke, I have 4 kids and they play the piano, and you can't learn to play the piano by being given a list of all the wrong notes not to play, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't work that way. You have to practice playing the right notes over time. And so this rhetoric, this conversation of don't is really hindering our ability to be successful digital citizens. And so that's the first flaw. We need to flip that. And it needs to be about do's, right?
Yeah.
What are the things we want you to do? How should you act in a virtual space? How do you be an upstander when you see, things happening that need to be called out? How do you recognize true and false information? Those are all positive statements. So keeping it positive is really critical. That's the first major flaw. The second flaw in our conversations is that it is almost entirely focused on what I would call online safety. And online safety, is, again, it's very important. Back to my example with my kids, I have a 15-year-old who's learning how to drive right now. When we get in the car, the first thing we do is we put on the seatbelt. There's no question. It's table stakes. We don't move the car out of the driveway until that seatbelt is on.
Mm-hmm.
But the vast majority of our time is not spent talking about the seatbelt. It's talking about where are we driving? Who are we driving with? Are we obeying the rules of the road as we go? What do we do in an emergency, right? That's the focus of the conversation. And when it comes to preparing young people to be effective in virtual spaces, it's the same thing, right? We can't spend all of our time being like, let's talk about the seatbelt and let's put the seatbelt in. Seatbelts are really important. Yes, of course they are. Put on the seatbelt. But now let's move on to the rest of the conversation that we are not having, which is how can we make sure we are being inclusive in virtual spaces? How can we use technology to engage with our community and make the world a better place? How can we be thoughtful consumers of information and recognize bias and information that is deliberately intended to throw us off, right? Help create safe spaces for others, right? Those are all the much broader skills that we need to be effective virtual citizens. If we can change the narrative around those two areas, flipping from being very negative, right, the don'ts to do's, and expanding beyond just basic block and tackle online safety to the broader skill set that we need to be healthy members of a virtual community. If we can do just those two things, we will actually have a very bright and very hopeful future digital world.
There you go, everybody. So that's the summary of the book. And when is the book out?
The book comes out July of 21.
Okay, right.
Although you can pre-order it on Amazon right now. So anybody who wants to go pre-order, there's my shameless plug, right? If you want to go sign up for it, then it won't just be my mom that's reading the book. So that would be As I've had some people have looked over it, the feedback that I've gotten is it's such a refreshing take for parents, right? Because it is positive and it is not an approach that says technology is evil and we should just go bury all of our phones in the backyard, right? It is saying technology it can be very good and can enrich our lives in powerful ways if we provide the right structure and framework around how it's being used in our families. And if we don't, then we have all these dysfunctional behaviors that get created. But if we can create some basic practices around how to set good boundaries and how to practice these positive digital citizenship skills, it turns out that technology can be a very positive influence in our families.
And that's what we want. I get, our children as they go along their life journey and they get to the point where they've gone to school, they're going to college, they're then going to work, they're using other people's information systems, they're having access to other people's information, that they grow and they take that with them. They take these values with them. And I think this is really, for me, when people ask me about organizational culture, how do I change the security culture? And I say, well, look, fundamentally, most of those cultural values have been formed when you're employed with children. Okay, so, what you're trying to do, what you're doing is tinkering around the edges. The only real way to really do this is to take a concerted effort about the future workforce, almost like drawing a line to the existing workforce and saying that we can do our best with them, okay, the values at the base of who they are, okay, that's come from deep within them. That's not something that a bit of training is going to help. It's not something that, threatening people with disciplinary action is going to do anything, or even a great communication program. Ideally, what you need is that bottom-up approach combined with reinforcing as people go through the journey of their life as well.
It's so true. And actually, a point that I make in the book is that as a society, we are vulnerable. We have allowed ourselves to become a very vulnerable society because we have not prepared for adults as well, but particularly my focus is at the next generation, to be thoughtful participants in a virtual world. And, our kids today, my kids, it's unlikely that they are going to have their, national or personal security compromised by bombs. But it is highly likely that they will have their national and personal security compromised by bytes, right? By, technical means that they are not prepared to address. And if we really want to create a secure, online environment, a safe online environment, whether at work or at home, there is no amount of catch up that we can do that will get ahead of that if some basic principles of being an effective digital citizen are not taught in the home. And that is just, it's your point. It is just crucial. Like, these conversations take a long time and they take practice, and they have to happen starting from the moment a kid first gets access to their device in a very positive and nurturing way. But we can't sort of play catch up 15 years later when all these dysfunctional habits are already in place. And so as parents, as youth leaders, as community leaders, as church leaders, it is truly a national security issue that we have not figured out how to have a more meaningful conversation about digital well-being.
And I think on that note, we're going to bring this one to an end, aren't we? Richard, fantastic. I suspect if we took a time for a coffee and a break, and maybe got some sleep, we could do this all over again tomorrow.
I'm sure. This is a wind me up and watch me go subject. I'll talk about this.
I know. The thing is, everybody's just listening into this. You and I are on video, and just to see the energy coming from Richard he's talking is amazing. It's amazing. Yes. Anyway, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Well, I'm pretty sure that you will have got a sense of how excited both Richard and I were to be talking about, his experience and our own thoughts around the challenges when it comes to sort of developing competency. So whether that be a bunch of employees or across a whole nation state or across the whole of society, when it comes to cybersecurity. I knew he would be interested in this because, as he said, his book, which you'll be able to find a link to that book in the podcast notes. And he draws a lot upon his own experience and exposure to cybersecurity and, learning and development both at a national level, but also at an organizational and academic level. And sort of, challenging some of the assumptions that people make when it comes to L&D. And those assumptions are being made all the time when it comes to learning and development, and building skills within our own organizations when it comes to security awareness, behavior, and culture. So if you like the show, you like those type of insights, so what can you do? Well, you can obviously tune in to the next episode. That's episode 5 in this first of our cybersecurity mini-series with our friends at Proofpoint, and find out a bit more about, what it takes to design something with the human in mind. If you want to make sure that you don't miss out on the next show, then probably the best way to do that is to subscribe via your publishing platform of choice, so maybe Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or go to the rethinkinghumanfactor.com website and you can subscribe there to the show as well. Anyway, it's been great having you here. I'm really looking forward to bringing episode 5 to you. So in the meantime, please do sit back and rethink the human factor.